How do I mix any color I want quickly and reliably? Fortunately, there are 3 to 5 steps only, using the same 3 color questions over and over. Let's jump right in. Step number 1, what color do I start with? Let's look at the end of the yellow arrow. There's a circle with a color inside. What would we start with to make that color? Or what is the starting color or hue? I'm seeing an orange color to start with. Let's look at the color at the end of the blue arrow. I'm seeing a starting color of yellow. Let's look at the color in the circle at the end of the green arrow. I'm seeing a starting color of red. Having said that, from a medical standpoint, we all see color a bit differently. So if you saw colors differently than what I saw, that's no problem, because with this system, you can start with any color and you will get to the color that you need. There may be fewer steps in some choices or more steps in others, but you will get there, which I find very reassuring. Step number 2, do I add white? This is the question that addresses the value of a color. In other words, its lightness or darkness. Let's go back to this slide. We can see light and dark best if we squint. We can assess value best when we squint. What is squinting? Squinting basically means closing your eyes and opening them just a little bit, so that just a little bit of light gets inside your eyeballs. What this does is it activates our nighttime vision, which is exquisitely sensitive to perceiving lights and darks, something that we need when assessing value. Now let's pretend that the chart on the left represents my palette. I want to mix up the red color at the end of the green arrow. So my starting color is the red in the chart. Do I add white in order to get the red of the apple? Well, let's compare the value of both. It looks to me as if the apple color is darker than what's on the palette. So it wouldn't make any sense to add white, so I'll simply skip adding the white step. What would you do to mix up the orange color on the pear, starting with the orange on the palette? Would you add white? Step number 3, do I neutralize? This is a question about chroma. High chroma is intense, saturated, straight out of the tube, brilliant color. Lower chroma or neutralized color has been dulled down, grayed down, muted by adding the complement color. Here is an example of high chroma and lower chroma. On the right is the higher chroma, closer to straight out of the tube, a little more saturated. And on the left, the blue has been dulled down by the addition of its complement, orange. Let's return to step 3. Do I neutralize? In other words, is my target color duller, grayer, lower chroma than what is on my palette? Let's look at the color in the circle on the left, the orangey color. Is that color dulled down, grayer, more neutralized, lower chroma than the orange on the palette in the chart on the left? Yes, so I would neutralize it by adding its complement, which is blue. The chart on the left also shows the complement pairs. In other words, to dull down orange, I would add a little bit of the blue. To dull down a purple, I would add yellow. To dull down green, I would add red. and the reverse is true. So this chart walks me through how I can neutralize or dull down or gray down a color. Let's talk about step number 4. Step number 4 of color mixing only is needed about 15% of the time. What that means is that 85% of the time we are nailing our color mixing using just steps 1 plus 2 plus 3. So 85% of the time we're nailing our color with 3 simple steps. If we don't nail it after 3 steps, we go to step number 4, which I call noodling. Noodling basically is asking, what one color do I add in order to get my target color? If you think about it, it's sort of like starting all over again with what color do I start with? So let's practice the system. Let's go to number 1. Number 1 starting color is green. Step 2, do I add white? Well, let's look at the green on the palette and let's look at the green in the circle. So the circle has a darker green than what's on the palette. So I will skip the adding white step. Now let's go to step number 3, which is the chroma step. The green of the trees definitely looks neutralized to me, so we would be neutralizing it with red. Let's go on to number 2 and try the system again. So starting color, I'm seeing yellow. Step number 2, would I add white? Well, the yellowish color in number 2 is darker than what's on the palette, so I will skip the adding white step. Third step is the chroma. Do I neutralize it? Compared to the swatch of high chroma next to it, it's neutralized. So I would add a little bit of purple to neutralize it. Now let's look at circle number 3. There's a purple color, so starting color is purple. Would I add white? It looks darker than the purple that's on the palette, so I will skip the adding white step. It looks ever so slightly neutralized, so I would just use a very small amount of yellow to neutralize that purple. Let's look at the color inside circle number 4. Starting color, blue. Step number 2, do I add white? Yes, because the color inside of the circle is lighter than the blue on the palette. How much white do I add? My goal is that the mixture that I'm making will be as light as what's in the circle in the image. So I need to squint in order to discern value or lightness and darkness. And I'll stop putting white in the mixture when the two values merge together when I'm squinting. They will be different colors, but they can have the same value as perceived when I squint. Here is that same image, but without all of the little chroma cards to help. So spend a couple of minutes having a look at all of the colors in all of the circles and going over in your mind the steps that you would take, step 1, step 2, step 3, and maybe step 4, in order to mix all of these colors. Talk it out, say the steps. It's very helpful to view colors in terms of their mixing formula, so to speak. Next, I'm going to be presenting a number of images so that you can practice color mixing verbally and in your head. Some of the images have the little helper chroma cards and some do not. So use the system. There's a lot of dots. I would go through them all. It will make a difference with your color mixing practice. Please simply stop the video on each image and take the time you need to do this exercise. Happy color mixing! Let's spend a minute on this slide. I'd like to talk about how sunlight affects a color and shadow affects a color. Let's have a look at the shutters. Number 2 is the shutter in sunlight, and number 1 is the same shutter in shadow. Notice how number 2 is lighter. It has a higher chroma. It feels like it's yellowier. I think of sunlight as yellow. Whereas number 1 is in shadow. It's darker and it's also more neutralized. Let's look at the wall. So number 3 also is a brighter, more intense color as compared to number 4, which is definitely darker, several shades darker, and feels almost like a different color, as if there's red in it, whereas in number 3 is more orangey yellow. So notice that to express a sunlit surface, I need to go to higher chroma. That's a huge master tip. It's not simply lightening a color to show a lit surface. It's also adding chroma. Here is another series of practice photos, some with the little chroma cards, some without circles. Try your hand at it. Practice color mixing on these. Thank you for listening and happy painting.